spookiest moment I had was when I went to go and talk at a primary school about careers, and the teacher, the headmistress, said, "Has anyone heard of Moonpig?" And about 300 primary school kids all went like you know, sort of as though they've been hypnotized. Moonpig.com. I thought, wow. I mean, the CIA would love to be able to get inside children's heads like that.
I think we'll open it up to the floor now for any members that have questions for Mr. Jenkins. I look to the member in the blue jacket.
Well, I think the first thing is when you're going to start a business is you've got to commit to a country, and that's quite a big thing. I mean, I lived in Russia for 9 years, but I was never going to commit to starting a business there because it wasn't. I just didn't feel comfortable enough with the legal structure and so on to actually say I'm going to be here for long enough to make this business work. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, right, if this works, am I happy to be here for the next 15 years? Every 3-year business plan takes 15 years, just does, and it just takes longer. So that's the first thing I think as a foreigner. I would say there is a much more vibrant entrepreneurial community now and a much more vibrant investor community in Britain than there certainly was 20 years ago. We have a very good, a lot of tax incentives for entrepreneurs who've exited businesses to reinvest in starter businesses through the EIS scheme and the SEIS scheme, which have been very, very successful in encouraging people like me to reinvest. Because the very best people at judging whether or not a startup is going to work is someone who's been through that cycle themselves. If you had a government department that was dishing out cash, trying to work out the best startup to invest in, they would make a hash of it. So what they realized very early on is what we need to do is just encourage entrepreneurs to risk some of their money, and we will chip in the tax they would have paid, and that's the incentive for them to want to encourage that. So I think we have a very encouraging environment. We're not as bold as the American startup community. I think it's easier to raise large amounts of money in America, but then the scale of the opportunity in America is so much bigger. When I look at one of the businesses I'm involved in where we look at, we're about to break into America, and we look at mid-sized firms that have a turnover of 5 billion. I think that's massive. So I understand why people are prepared to invest more money in startups, and I think also they're prepared to throw more money at the wall and hope some of it sticks. Whereas here, I think you have to work quite hard in the early stages to raise money. But I think it's a very welcoming environment, and also the fact that someone is foreign doesn't make any difference whatsoever. People are always welcoming new ideas.
I look to the member in the back bench.
Yeah, I think you need when you first started. Once you've got to a position where you have enough money to be able to guarantee that you're actually going to be able to pay them for more than a year, then suddenly you're into hiring a different league of people. You're hiring people who are not worried about the risks of being in a startup. The risk of joining a startup is that you run out of money in 3 months' time, and entrepreneurs tend to be pretty bad at crashing things into the ground and then telling everyone, really sorry, but I can't actually pay your salary for the last 2 months, and we've just gone under. So and a lot of people don't want that, quite understandably. So when you have enough money to be able to pay them properly, then that's what. I do think it's important to make people feel included through option schemes, and but there are ways in which you can incentivize people with a share in the business without actually just constantly giving out shares. You do it through an option scheme that if they're there at the end when it exits, they will benefit. But if they leave quickly, they don't. But by and large, when you can afford to pay people a proper salary, they're not sacrificing anything. So they're just like any other hire. Whereas the ones that you try to get on board when you have no money, those guys are the guys who are taking a risk that they're not going to get paid, or they're taking a pay cut, and that is a different kettle of fish.
I recognise the member in the front row there.
So, like, the big thing in marketing is the little, like, musical motifs, like the one in McDonald's, the little...
Yep.
And like, Danone. Another one is Moonpig.com. Can you talk about how that...
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one because there hadn't been one for a while. What you find with sound bites is they jingles, as they're known, there's a rash of them, and then everyone gets a bit sick of them, and thinks, oh no, jingles, really passé. No one does them for a few years, and then someone says, no one's done a jingle for a few years, I think we can get away with it. And so we just caught it right. I think we were there at the same time as, I've forgotten the other, Go Compare. Go Compare happened around about the same time, so there were a couple around, but it worked. I think the other thing is we only spent £30,000 on the advert, so the production values were quite different from the production values of other adverts, which sort of made it stand out, by being a bit cheap. But funny enough, you need to stand out, and so you'd be watching a whole lot of very, very slick adverts of motor car. You'd get a whole lot of lovely music, and I've got no idea what this is about, but it's lovely, and then Moonpig.com, and what was that? And so it jarred, and that's kind of, you need to wake people up in the seats. What was that? Not like an advert I've seen. So that was, the interesting thing about an advert I had to learn is that we had to educate people about, we had 30 seconds and maximum of 80 words to be able to convey the idea. First of all, this is a real greeting card, because when we first started, and obviously no one else had done this before, people would say, I chat to them about it, and they go, so these are e-cards. No, they're not e-cards. No, these are real cards. So we had to get over the idea, first of all, that these were real cards. So we had to show a real person coming through a letterbox, arriving. Oh, so it's something that comes through those. Then we had to show somebody on a screen replacing the name within the front page of the card, so people didn't understand that the personalisation wasn't just "Happy Birthday, John, lots of love, Nick." It was about changing the front page. So we had to convey a lot of message in that advert, and then get people to remember the name. So the jingle was very, very helpful. The spookiest moment I had was when I went to go and talk at a primary school about careers, and the teacher, the headmistress, said, "Has anyone heard of Moonpig?" And about 300 primary school kids all went like sort of as though they'd been hypnotized. Moonpig.com. I thought, wow. I mean, the CIA would love to be able to get inside children's heads like that. But so it's very, very powerful stuff. We all remember the jingles from our youth. And we had a Mars a day helps you work, rest, and play. That was a big one when I was around. They work well.
Could you talk a bit more about the carbon technology that you're currently involved in?
Yes. So I have a large stake in a company called Green Energy Options, and we make the in-home displays that go inside. When you get a smart meter fitted, you get an in-home display that tells you how much energy, electricity, and gas you're using. And our next generation of that is it combines with a thermostat and controls your boiler. Now here's a very interesting. I mean, I could talk about plumbing for quite a long time, but I do have enough self-awareness to know that's not a very interesting subject for most people. But people talk, when you buy a gas boiler, they sell you it on the basis that it's 95% efficient. What they don't tell you is that it's only 95% efficient if you have it heating the water at below 70 degrees. Every single installer who installs these things turns the volume up high. So almost every boiler in this country is operating at 70% efficiency. So there's a potential to save 20% of the gas bill, of the amount of gas used in heating in the UK. And so the new version of our device talks to the boiler, regardless of whatever setting it's on. It talks to the boiler in a way that makes sure that it's always on the most efficient setting. And that itself could save an enormous amount of gas, being that the houses will be just as warm, but it will, just by using a bit of intelligence, it will save an enormous amount of gas in heating. So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. The other thing we get involved in is the management of the grid. We're going to have to electrify a lot of our homes in the next 20 years. And the problem you have with that is that if every Tom, Dick and Harry has an electric water heater and they flick it on, then it would all be about 8 o'clock, so there would be a massive surge. And you have to build your electrical system to cope with whatever the surge is. So there's a lot of money in managing the demand and trying to work out how can we do that. So if we have a large battery in the house, what we can do is we can trickle feed that battery, and then the battery can feed that spur. So what the system sees is just a constant demand of electricity. So there's lots of really interesting stuff which will help us solve the problem of how do we get to carbon zero. It'll be a combination of a lot of different solutions. And that's the bit that I find really, really fascinating. I recently installed ground source heat pumps in my house. My house is 420 years old, and people said it will never work, it'll never work. It works brilliantly, even this week. So that's been, so there's a combination really of the technology is kind of simple enough for me to understand. You know, I'm not that bright, so it's not too difficult, and I can get my head around it. I love the physics of it, and I love the understanding how it fits in with the bigger picture of how we generate electricity and power in the country, and ultimately it's a problem we're going to have to crack. So I find that really interesting.
So you seem to be in this field of like mining in Russia, where you get to meet a lot of tough guys who make money, you know, out of the ground. So how do you think it gave you a lot of confidence interacting with these people like David Abramovich when you came to UK and like started your own business?
Well, I mean, having moved from the commodity trading business in Moscow, where I lost 6 of my clients to gunfire or bombs, to go into the greeting card business was quite a pleasant change. To my knowledge, nobody has been murdered in the greeting card business in the UK for quite a long time. So I mean, there was it was a welcome. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I loved my time in Russia. But commodity trading was a bit of that was a tough environment to be in. I wasn't involved. Aluminium was the worst. I mean, the guys in our aluminium department had this bulletproof car, bomb-proof car that they had to pick up clients in, and nobody wanted to drive it because everybody realized it was always the driver that got it. Those were interesting times.
Out of all the companies that you've invested in or seen come across your purview in Dragon's Den, which one like surprised you most out? You thought this isn't going to work, these people don't know what they're doing, and then they actually ended up doing really well. And also the ones.
There have been a few successes that I saw during my time there. Oppo ice cream, I think you probably have heard of that one. That came on the show relatively early on. They've done really, really well. They didn't take. I can't remember. I think I might have offered investment. They didn't take investment in the end, but they went on to do very well. There have been one of my. The two ones that did very well that I invested in was the Sublime Science, which was a children's science party business, which I think we sold 18 months after we invested in it. That did very well, which was great fun. And the Snaffling Pig pork scratching business, which went on to do very well. But then there are equally there are some that have just. It's very interesting going back, and I go through occasionally go through the list of all the ones I looked at and just check them on Companies House and see if or look them up on Google and see if they're still going. The reality is business is quite tough, and a lot of them just plod on as they were, and they don't really grow, they don't really shrink. There are a lot of businesses that just don't grow. It's easy when you speak to the sort of the entrepreneurial, the young startup community. There's a sort of belief that everything we'll start here and we'll go to there and we'll go to there, and the reality is not many companies do. And there is a bit of survivor bias in that the people who come to talk to you at places like this are generally the people who have done well. So you don't hear from the people who failed. At my business school, we used to get entrepreneurs to come and talk to us. We had one guy who'd invested his entire family fortune in a cutlery business in Sheffield. And he'd start his thing by saying, I've been invited here to tell you how things can go wrong. My company was a complete disaster and I lost all my money, and this is how it happened. And I was so grateful that he would come up and talk to us about failure, because very often people don't. So you have to understand how many companies just either never really grow or just die. What happens more often than not is that they make enough money to keep the entrepreneur alive, never enough money to pay any dividends, and no one ever buys them. And that's sort of a zombie investment. It's the living dead. You don't get any return from that at all, and that's the worst. I'd rather they died early, failed early, or did well later on. But
so I have one last question for you
Yeah.
before we wrap up. What piece of advice would you give to the students of the University of Oxford and our members? And can you give us something to think about this week?
Yeah, I talk at quite a lot of schools about entrepreneurship as a career. And there are two paths to entrepreneurship. You can either learn about a particular sector, be employed for 20 years, get all the contacts, get all the knowledge of a sector, and then, after 20 years, approach investors and say, I know all about this sector, I would like to invest for you to invest in me to do my own thing. That's one way of going about it. And by that point, you've got proven back, you're much more investable because you've got experience, a bit of maturity, and you've got contacts, and you know the sector that you're in. So you're more likely to get investment. But you're also at a stage when it's quite difficult to take risk. On the other hand, if you start when you're 20, 21, you can afford to fail. If you're already on nothing and you haven't got anything, you haven't got very far to go back. So you can afford to fail a couple of times, and every time you fail, you'll learn something more from that. And eventually, and you have to pick businesses that don't require a huge amount of investment. There are plenty of businesses that start up without any investment and grow organically and get there. And you might start one, and that grows. You find lots of students who start businesses organising parties, organising events, and that then morphs into something else that they do after university. But it's about cutting your teeth as an entrepreneur and learning a bit about accounting. You learn a bit about law, and you gradually pick it up. 5 or 10 years in, by the time you're 30, you're actually quite experienced at business, and you've got a couple of things that have done well, and by that point you can end up doing the thing that you'll then become more investable. And so I do think that it isn't, and people often say, it's always such a risky career. The one advice I would give to you from my position, I'm now 56, I don't feel it, but I am, apparently, is that when you're 56, the worst thing is when you've had a career in banking and you get made redundant at a point when you have family to support, you've got school fees, you've got the most expensive time of your life. You lose your job in banking when you're 50, you're not going back in. And that is far more risky than having a few failures when you're 20. If you can learn to employ yourself, you will always employ yourself, regardless of however old you might be, and regardless of, so you will never be prejudiced against yourself. So learning those entrepreneurial skills and learning how to employ yourself very early on is actually, bizarrely, not a risky thing to do. It's actually an insurance policy for later on. And just remember, if you start with nothing and you end up with nothing, you're no worse off. So that's perhaps the message I'd leave. And as a career, it's a very exciting one. There's never been, the most important thing I think I've learned from it is that I've had exciting moments, I've had terrifying moments, I have never been bored. And I've done some jobs in the past where I've been bored. I had a dreadful job at university when I was a clerical job where I was copying license details from one ledger into another ledger, and by 10:30 I'd be looking at the clock thinking, please let it be 5 o'clock. No, it's 10:30. It was physically painful, it was so boring. But I've never been bored. I've always, in life, you want to get to 5 o'clock and wish it was still 2 o'clock because you've got loads more that you would like to get done. You never want to get to 2 o'clock and wish it was 5 o'clock. And a lot of people end up doing jobs because they look like great careers and they think they'll get a fantastic salary, and they get to 2 o'clock and they wish it was 5 o'clock. Or if you're a lawyer, you wish it was 11 o'clock in the evening so you could go home, because they have to work late. But that's perhaps the one thing I'd leave you with is entrepreneurship as a career is not as risky as you might think it would be. And there's never a dull moment.
Well, thank you so much for coming to be with us this evening, and it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.